The air in courtroom 3B was stale, tasting of cheap disinfectant and quiet desperation. It was a place where minor infractions were magnified into character-defining flaws by the men who presided over it. Judge Alistair Albright surveyed his domain from his elevated throne of polished oak, his black robes a shroud of petty authority. His face, a permanent mask of sour disapproval, scanned the handful of citizens waiting on the hard wooden benches. They were the day's collection of municipal sinners, a woman who had let her dog off its leash, a teenager who had driven 5 miles over the speed limit, a homeowner whose fence was 2 inches too high. To Judge Albright, they were all nails, and he was the only hammer the world needed. He cleared his throat, a dry, rasping sound that commanded immediate silence. "Next case," he droned, his voice devoid of anything but impatience. City of Oak Haven vs. Sarah Jennings. A young woman with anxious eyes clutched her purse and approached the defendant's table. Albright glared at the paper in front of him. Expired parking meter. For 2 hours. 2 hours, Miss Jennings. Does time have no meaning to you? Do the rules of a civilized society simply float past your awareness like clouds in the sky? The woman flinched. "I'm so sorry, Your Honor. My daughter's appointment at the clinic ran long. It was an emergency." "An emergency," the judge repeated, savoring the word as if it were a spoiled piece of fruit. "Everyone has an emergency. The city's coffers would be empty if we accepted every emergency as a valid excuse to flout the law. Is that the kind of city you want to live in, Miss Jennings? Anarchy. Chaos born of forgotten parking meters." "No, Your Honor," she whispered, her gaze fixed on the floor. "Then you will learn a valuable lesson today about time management and civic responsibility. Fine is doubled. Next." He banged the gavel, a sharp crack that made the woman jump. She scurried away, tears welling in her eyes, a fresh wound of public humiliation stinging her cheeks. Martin Kelly watched from the back row. He sat perfectly still, a small island of calm in the judge's turbulent sea. He was a man of medium height and build, with hair just beginning to gray at the temples. His suit was simple, clean, and well-pressed, but unremarkable. He could have been an accountant, a high school history teacher, or a man who sold insurance. There was nothing about him that drew the eye, save for one small detail. On the lapel of his charcoal gray jacket, pinned just over his heart, was a small, 5-pointed star, suspended from a pale blue ribbon dotted with its own constellation of 13 smaller stars. It was a quiet splash of color against the drab fabric, a detail so modest it was easily overlooked. Martin was not here to contest his ticket. He had been cited for a rolling stop at an intersection with a clear line of sight for miles in every direction. It was a minor thing, a moment of inattention on a quiet Sunday afternoon. He was prepared to pay the fine and be on his way. That was his nature: accept responsibility, resolve the issue, move forward. Another case was called, an elderly man with a stoop in his shoulders who had failed to trim a hedge bordering city property. Judge Albright lectured him for 10 minutes on the societal decay represented by unkempt shrubbery before levying a fine that was clearly a hardship for the old man. Martin felt a familiar tightening in his gut. It was the same feeling he'd had watching bullies on the schoolyard, or overbearing officers berating young soldiers for a scuffed boot. It was the casual cruelty of a man who mistook power for strength. He took a slow, deliberate breath, letting it out just as slowly. He centered himself. This was just another room, another man in a position of authority. He had faced far worse. Next, the judge's voice boomed. City of Oak Haven vs. Martin Kelly. Martin stood. He walked toward the front of the courtroom with a steady, measured gait. There was no defiance in his posture, only a quiet dignity. He stood before the bench, his hands clasped loosely behind his back. Judge Albright adjusted his spectacles and peered down, his eyes immediately falling to the blue ribbon on Martin's lapel. A frown creased his brow. "Mr. Kelly," he began, his tone already dripping with condescension. "You are here today regarding a violation of Traffic Code 4-17, failure to come to a complete stop. How do you plead?" "I do not contest the citation, Your Honor," Martin said, his voice calm and even. "I am here to pay the fine." Albright ignored his plea. His focus remained fixed on the small object on Martin's chest. He saw it not as an emblem of anything, but as a gaudy affectation, a bauble. In his courtroom, he was the only one entitled to decoration. "What is that thing on your jacket?" the judge demanded, pointing a bony finger. Martin's eyes did not waver. "It's a medal, Your Honor." "A medal," Albright scoffed, leaning back in his chair as if to get a better look at the absurdity. "I am aware it is a medal, Mr. Kelly. I am not a fool." "For what, may I ask?" "Perfect attendance at a sales conference." "A prize from a cereal box." A few nervous titters echoed from the gallery. Martin remained silent. The question was not worthy of an answer. The medal spoke for itself, to those who knew its language. His silence only seemed to stoke the judge's irritation. "This is a courtroom, sir. A place of law and order. It is a serious place for serious people. It is not a stage for you to display your trinkets. There are no symbols of authority permitted in here besides the seal of this great state and the robes I wear." The judge leaned forward, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. "Take it off." The demand hung in the stale air. The nervous shuffling in the gallery ceased. Every eye was on Martin Kelly. Martin's expression did not change, but inside, a steel door slammed shut. He thought of the men who were with him that day. He saw their faces, heard their voices. He felt the suffocating dust and the searing heat. He remembered the weight of his friend, Sergeant Evans, as he carried him through the fire. This medal was not his. He was merely its custodian. It belonged to them. "I'm sorry, Your Honor," Martin said, his voice still quiet, yet now infused with a resolve as hard as granite. "I can't do that." Judge Albright's face began to flush a deep, mottled red. He was not accustomed to being denied. He was not accustomed to it at all. "You can't," the judge repeated, his voice rising in disbelief. "Did you just say you can't? Or do you mean you won't, Mr. Kelly? Let us be precise with our language." "I will not remove it, Your Honor," Martin clarified, his gaze unwavering. "And why is that?" Albright sneered. "Is that little piece of tin so important to you that you would defy a direct order from a judge in a court of law?" Martin took a moment before he spoke, choosing his words with immense care. "This medal was presented to me on behalf of the people of the United States. It doesn't feel right to take it off in a public building." His answer was humble, almost deferential, yet it was a line drawn in the sand. Albright saw it as a challenge, a direct assault on his authority. "The people of the United States are not on trial here, Mr. Kelly, you are. And I am the representative of the people in this room. I am the law. And the law demands respect for this court." He slammed his hand on the bench, not the gavel, but his open palm. The slap of flesh on wood echoed through the silent room. "I am ordering you one last time," he hissed, leaning so far forward his robes bunched around his neck. "Remove that medal, or I will hold you in contempt of court. You will spend the night in a cell contemplating the foolishness of your arrogance. Do you understand me?" In the corner of the courtroom, a young bailiff named Deputy Miller felt a cold sweat prickle his skin. Miller was barely 25, a Marine veteran who had done one tour in Afghanistan before trading his desert camouflage for a sheriff's department uniform. He ran courtroom security because it was quiet, a stark contrast to the life he had known before. He had noticed the men in the gray suit earlier. More specifically, he had noticed the pale blue ribbon. He had seen it only once before, in a glass case at the National Museum of the Marine Corps. His blood ran cold. He knew what it was. He watched the exchange, his heart pounding against his ribs. The judge was a pompous fool, but he was a judge. Miller's duty was to follow the judge's orders. But every fiber of his being, every lesson learned in boot camp, every ounce of respect he held for the code he had lived by, screamed that what was happening was a sacrilege. Judge Albright was not just disrespecting a man, he was desecrating a symbol that was held sacred by every man and woman who had ever worn the uniform. Miller tried to catch the judge's eye, to give some kind of signal, a shake of the head, anything to stop the train from hurtling off the cliff. But Albright was locked onto his target, his vision tunneled by rage and wounded pride. He saw nothing else. The judge's final ultimatum settled over the room. Jail, or remove the medal. Martin Kelly did not even seem to hesitate. "With all due respect, Your Honor," he said, his voice a paradigm of calm. "This medal was awarded in the name of the Congress of the United States. It was placed around my neck by the president. I will not disrespect their honor, or the honor of the men I served with, by removing it. He had not raised his voice. He had not postured. He had simply stated a fact. It was an immovable object meeting a force that believed itself to be irresistible. That's it. Albright roared, his face purple. You have sealed your fate, you arrogant little man. I find you in contempt of this court. Bailiff, take this man into custody. Deputy Miller was frozen. His mind was a battlefield. His duty as a bailiff warred with his honor as a Marine. To lay a hand on that man, on the custodian of that medal, felt like a profound betrayal. He took a hesitant step forward, his hand hovering near his handcuffs. His eyes met Martin's. In the older man's gaze, he saw no fear, no anger. He saw only a quiet, sad understanding. It was a look that said, "Do what you have to do, son." And that broke him. Miller stopped. He turned his head slightly toward the clerk's desk, where an emergency phone sat. He knew he was risking his job, risking the judge's wrath. But there were lines that could not be crossed. As Albright began to launch into a self-righteous tirade about the breakdown of respect in modern society, Miller took 2 steps back, into the small anteroom behind his post. His hands were shaking as he picked up the receiver. He had a number on a card in his wallet, a number he was given by his former company commander when he left the service. It was for emergencies. He had never used it. He dialed. He prayed someone would answer. Contempt. Judge Albright was shouting, his voice cracking. It is a disease. And it will not be tolerated in my courtroom. 48 hours in the county jail will teach you the meaning of respect, Mr. Kelly. 48 hours to think about your childish defiance. Martin stood impassively, his posture unchanged. He was ready. He had spent nights in far worse places than the Oak Haven County Jail. It was a small price to pay. Bailiff, the judge shrieked, noticing Miller was not at his side. Where is the bailiff? Get in here and cuff this man now. Just as Miller stepped back into the courtroom, his face pale, the main doors at the back of the room swung open with such force that they banged against the walls. The sound was like a thunderclap, and it cut through Judge Albright's rant, silencing him instantly. Every head in the courtroom swiveled around. Framed in the doorway stood a man who seemed to command the very air around him. He was tall and broad-shouldered, his posture ramrod straight. He wore the immaculate Class A uniform of a United States Army general, his chest a brilliant tapestry of ribbons and medals that told the story of a lifetime of service. 2 stars gleamed on each of his shoulders. On his face was an expression of controlled, icy fury. He was flanked by 2 uniformed military police officers, their white helmets and polished brass making them look like avenging angels. The general's eyes, the color of cold steel, swept the room, taking in the scene in a single, comprehensive glance, the sputtering, apoplectic judge on the bench, the stunned crowd on the benches, and the quiet, solitary man standing at the defendant's table. His gaze rested on Martin Kelly. A flicker of profound respect, almost reverence, crossed his features before being replaced by that same cold fury, now directed squarely at the men in the black robes. Major General Thomas Thompson strode down the center aisle, his footsteps echoing like hammer blows on the worn linoleum floor. The crowd parted before him as if the Red Sea. He did not stop until he reached the bar separating the gallery from the court. He did not ask permission to approach. He simply moved with an authority that was absolute and unquestionable. Judge Albright, for the first time that day, seemed at a loss for words. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound emerged. His self-importance evaporated, leaving behind a bewildered, frightened little man. "What, who are you?" Albright finally managed to stammer. "This is a court of law. You cannot just burst in here." General Thompson's voice, when he spoke, was not loud, but it filled the entire room. It was a voice accustomed to cutting through the din of battle and being instantly obeyed. "I am Major General Thomas Thompson, commander of the 7th Infantry Division at Fort Carson," he stated, his eyes boring into the judge. "And you, sir, are about to have a very, very bad day." The general turned his head slightly toward the gallery. "Is there a reporter in the room?" A young man in the 3rd row timidly raised his hand, holding up a small notepad. "Good," Thompson said. "Make sure you get this all down." Every word. He turned back to the bench. I was at a regional command briefing 10 minutes away when I received a call from a young Marine veteran in this courtroom, a Deputy Miller. He nodded curtly toward the bailiff, who stood straighter, a look of profound relief on his face. He informed me that a United States judge was in the process of illegally ordering a Medal of Honor recipient to remove his award, and was threatening him with incarceration for refusing. A collective gasp went through the courtroom. The words, Medal of Honor, hung in the air, charged with meaning. The whispers started instantly. People looked from the imposing general to the quiet man in the gray suit, and back again. Understanding began to dawn on their faces, followed quickly by shame. Judge Albright's face had gone from red to a sickly, chalky white. Medal of Honor. That's preposterous. He's just some man with a traffic ticket. That some man, General Thompson's voice dropped, becoming lethally quiet, is retired Master Sergeant Martin Kelly. And yes, he was awarded the Medal of Honor for actions above and beyond the call of duty during Operation Enduring Freedom. He wears that medal today because he is attending the funeral of a man from his unit later this afternoon. A man who died in his arms. The general took a step closer to the bench, his voice resonating with contempt. You refer to it as a trinket. A piece of tin. Let me educate you, Your Honor. That trinket is the highest award for valor in combat that this nation can bestow. It is awarded for gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of one's life, above and beyond the call of duty. He paused, letting the weight of his words sink in. Furthermore, he continued, his tone becoming sharp and clinical, your order to have him remove it is a violation of federal law. The Stolen Valor Act of 2013, which you should know is an extension of protections for military honors, makes it clear that the dignity of these awards is to be protected. While it primarily targets those who wear awards they did not earn, its spirit is to prevent the very kind of disrespect and humiliation you have engaged in today. Thompson's gaze was relentless. You did not just disrespect a man, Judge Albright. You disrespected the 156 members of the United States Congress who voted to award him this medal. You disrespected the president who placed it around his neck. And you disrespected the memory of the 8 men who died on the day Master Sergeant Kelly earned it. The judge seemed to shrink in his robes. He looked around the courtroom, but found no friendly faces. The audience that had nervously chuckled at his earlier jokes now stared at him with open disgust. I did not know, he stammered, his voice a pathetic whine. How was I supposed to know? You were supposed to know by the quiet dignity of the men standing before you, the general thundered, his voice finally rising to a parade ground roar that shook the very windows. You were supposed to know by conducting yourself with the temperament and wisdom befitting your office, instead of acting like a petty tyrant. Your ignorance is not an excuse, it is a damning indictment of your character. General Thompson held up his hand, and one of the military police officers stepped forward, handing him a folder. In the 15 minutes it took me to get here, the general said, his voice returning to its icy calm, I have spoken with the governor of this state. I have spoken with the chairman of the State Commission on Judicial Conduct. And I have spoken to Senator Michelson, who sits on the Armed Services Committee and who remembers Master Sergeant Kelly's ceremony very well. He slapped the folder down on the prosecutor's table. The sound was like a gunshot. As of this moment, Judge Alistair Albright, you are suspended from your duties, pending a full and immediate investigation by the Commission. I have it on good authority that by the end of the week, you will be permanently removed from the bench. Your judicial career is over. The finality of the declaration was absolute. Judge Albright slumped in his chair, a broken man. The gavel, his symbol of power, lay on the oak bench, now just a piece of wood. General Thompson ignored him completely. He turned and walked to where Martin Kelly stood. He stopped directly in front of him, his own posture softening from rigid anger to one of deep and profound respect. He looked at the small blue ribbon on Martin's lapel. Then he looked Martin in the eye. Master Sergeant Kelly, he said, his voice now filled with a warmth and sincerity that was startling. On behalf of the United States Army, and a grateful nation, I apologize for the disrespect you have been shown today. Then, in the middle of the silent courtroom, Major General Thomas Thompson, a 2-star general, drew himself up to his full height and rendered a crisp, perfect salute to the quiet man in the gray suit. Martin Kelly, his face betraying a flicker of emotion for the first time, returned the salute with equal precision. The spell broke. The courtroom erupted, not in chaos, but in a wave of spontaneous applause. It started with a few people in the back and quickly swelled, a thunderous ovation of support and apology from the very people who had sat silently through Martin's humiliation. Deputy Miller stood by his post, tears streaming down his face, clapping so hard his hands stung. General Thompson lowered his salute and put a hand on Martin's shoulder. "Let's get you out of here, Sergeant." He turned and glared at the now empty prosecutor's table. "And for the record, the citation for the rolling stop is dismissed." He guided Martin toward the aisle. As they walked, the crowd on the benches stood up, a spontaneous gesture of respect. Men and women, young and old, simply stood as he passed, their faces a mixture of awe and shame. They reached the back of the courtroom. Martin paused and turned to Deputy Miller. "Thank you, son," he said quietly. "It was my honor, Sergeant," Miller choked out, standing at attention. Martin and the general walked out into the bright sunlight, leaving the wreckage of a man's career and a courtroom full of newly enlightened citizens behind them. The story of what happened in courtroom 3B spread through Oakhaven like wildfire. By evening, it was the lead story on the local news. The young reporter who had been in the gallery had indeed gotten every word, and his article was a scathing account of the judge's arrogance and a glowing tribute to the quiet hero at the center of it all. Alistair Albright was officially and permanently removed from the bench 3 days later. He left the courthouse in disgrace, avoiding the cameras and shouted questions from reporters. He became a pariah in the town where he had once held so much power. His name became a local cautionary tale about pride and its inevitable fall. A week after the incident, a news crew found Martin Kelly. He wasn't at a press conference or a public event. He was in his front yard, quietly tending to his rose bushes. He had been avoiding the media, but this young reporter seemed sincere, so he agreed to a short interview. The reporter, a woman named Jessica, held out her microphone. "Mr. Kelly, the whole country is talking about what happened. You've become a symbol of quiet strength. People are calling Judge Albright a monster. Do you have anything to say to him?" The nation expected fire and brimstone. They expected a triumphant hero to gloat over the vanquished villain. Martin Kelly did something else entirely. He put down his gardening shears and wiped his hands on a cloth. He looked directly into the camera, but he wasn't speaking to the audience. He was speaking to one man. "I don't believe Judge Albright is a monster," he said, his voice gentle. "I believe he was a man who let his position get the better of him. He forgot that his robe and his gavel were symbols of service, not of power." He paused, choosing his next words as carefully as he had in the courtroom. "He made a mistake," Martin continued. "He didn't understand what my medal meant, and he acted out of that lack of understanding. He's paid a very high price for that mistake. I don't feel any anger toward him. I just feel sad that it happened." The reporter was taken aback. "So you forgive him?" "Forgiveness isn't about letting him off the hook," Martin explained patiently. "He faced the consequences of his actions. Forgiveness is about letting myself off the hook. Holding on to anger is like drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. I saw enough hate and anger in my service to last a lifetime. I don't have room for it here." He picked up a newly bloomed red rose and held it carefully. "I hope," he said, his voice soft but clear, "that he can find some peace. I hope our community learns that true strength isn't about how loud you can shout or how much authority you have. It's about how much you can endure, and how much grace you can show when you've been wronged. That's the hardest lesson of all." He then politely thanked the reporter, said he had to get back to his roses, and went inside his modest home. That final act of mercy, broadcast across the country, did more to define Martin Kelly's character than any citation for valor ever could. The story was no longer about a judge's downfall, it was about a hero's grace. In Oakhaven, the atmosphere in the courthouse began to change. The new judge who replaced Albright made it a point to listen, to show compassion, to treat every person who came before the bench with dignity. Deputy Miller received a departmental commendation for his actions. He was hailed as a hero in his own right, but he always deferred, saying he just did what any Marine would have done. The town learned a lesson that day. They learned that heroes often walk among them, disguised as ordinary men in simple gray suits. And they learned that the ultimate measure of a person's strength is not found in the power they wield over others, but in the mercy they choose to give. Martin Kelly continued to live his quiet life. His neighbors would see him walking his dog or buying groceries. They would nod, and he would nod back. But now, their simple greeting was imbued with a new, profound respect. And sometimes, on days of remembrance, they would see him wearing his simple suit, on his way to honor the fallen. And on his lapel, just over his heart, would be the small, five-pointed star and the pale blue ribbon, a quiet, constant reminder of the price of freedom, and the enduring power of a humble heart. It was a symbol not of what he had done, but of what he represented, the quiet professional, the resilient soul, the man whose greatest victory was not won on a battlefield, but in a small town courtroom, with a simple act of forgiveness.